Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Gil Klein. I am the club's president and a national correspondent with Media General Newspapers. I'd like to welcome the club members in the audience today, as well as those of you who are watching us on C-SPAN or listening to us on National Public Radio or the Internet Global Computer Network. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind you of some upcoming speakers. On Monday, April 25th, Aung San Suu Kyi, Chief Secretary of Hong Kong, will present a speech entitled Hong Kong, Little Dragon, Big Future. On Tuesday, April 26th, Bill Malden, a cartoonist, the famous cartoonist, World War II cartoonist, will speak in conjunction with the National Portrait Gallery exhibit, Reporting the War, the Journalistic Coverage of World War II, which salutes war correspondents who covered the Second World War. And on Wednesday, April 27th, Senator Bill Bradley, Democrat of New Jersey, will talk about violence in America. Transcripts and audio and videotapes of this luncheon are available by calling 1-800-500-9911. If you have any questions for our speakers, and I trust that you will, please write them on the cards provided for you at the tables and pass them up to me, and I will ask as many as time allows. I'd like now to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. Please withhold your applause until all the names are read. From your right, Henry Hartzenbusch of the Universal Press Syndicate. Carl Hartman of the Associated Press. Richard Salmon of Congressional Quarterly and a member of the Board of Governors of the National Press Club. Ed Gresser, legislative aide to Senator Baucus. David Ahern, Washington Bureau Chief for the Bloomberg Business News. Skipping over one speaker for the moment, we have Christy Wise, freelance journalist and the chairwoman of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Skipping over our second speaker, we have Jack Reynolds of Jack Reynolds Communications and the member of the Speakers Committee who arranged today's luncheon. Next to him, we're honored to have Liu Binyan, editor of China Focus and a leader in the international Chinese dissident community. Next to him, we have William Eaton of the Los Angeles Times. Next to him, we have Junji Miura of the Kyoto News Service. And finally, Douglas Harbrecht of Business Week. We are altering our usual press club luncheon format today for a special event, a debate on whether the Clinton administration should continue to extend most favored nation status to the People's Republic of China. This issue has been hotly debated since the Tiananmen Square massacre in June of 1989, when Chinese troops forcefully put down a demonstration that was trying to open up the nation to democracy. As a candidate, Bill Clinton had criticized President Bush and the Republicans for saying that the best hope for opening the Chinese society was maintaining trade relations. Now, as president, Mr. Clinton must face the economic and political consequences if the United States actually followed through with its threat to end most favored nation status. The president is expected to announce his decision on June 4th. As one State Department official said this week, it's human rights on the one side and business on the other. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Our guests today are Senator Max Baucus of Montana and Representative Nancy Pelosi of California, represent two different schools of thought within the Democratic Party. Congresswoman Pelosi of San Francisco sits on the Foreign Operations Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee. She chairs the Congressional Working Group on China and serves on the House Intelligence Committee. After Tiananmen Square, Representative Pelosi wrote and helped push through Congress a bill protecting Chinese students in the United States and another bill requiring China to improve its human rights record in order to continue to receive most favored nation status. Congress passed both acts, but President Bush vetoed them. The Congresswoman has argued that the United States should use its considerable economic clout with China to press Beijing harder on human rights. Senator Max Baucus has served 2 terms in the House before his election to the Senate in 1978. He is chairman of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee and a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, where he chairs the Subcommittee on International Trade. He also serves on the Intelligence and Agricultural Committees. While Senator Baucus has criticized China's human rights policy, he has said that tying that policy to most favored nation status is ineffective and harmful to China's reform process. Senator Baucus has said that revoking MFN is the trade equivalent of dropping a nuclear bomb, and it would launch a nasty counterproductive trade war. Now on to the debate. Both of our guests will have a 12-minute statement and a 5-minute rebuttal. Then we will take your written questions. The order of appearance was done previously by a flip of the coin, and Senator Baucus chose to receive. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Max Baucus.
Thank you very much, Gil, and members of the National Press Club, members of the Fourth Estate, curious onlookers and friends. Before I begin, I'd like to recognize 2 good friends and associates of mine in my life as a public servant, and that's Owen and Virginia Garrett. Why do I recognize them? When I first ran for public office 20 years ago, seeking the Western congressional seat, I can remember sitting in Owen's office. He's the owner, he and Virginia, publisher of the Silver State Post. And I did not know they're in Washington. I had not seen them in many years, 10, 15 years, I think. They walked up to me, and I just wanted to recognize Virginia and Owen, and I don't know the answer to that question yet, is why in the world I want to run for public office. Anyway, Owen, it's very good to see you here. The argument over MFN status for China is not new. It's about 4 years old. Most of us think it began with the massacre of Tiananmen. But in fact, it really began later. It really opened when Congress became convinced that the Bush administration would do nothing, not only on China's human rights abuses, but on trade barriers and sales of dangerous weapons. Many people felt MFN conditions were the only alternative to the Bush policy. I then disagreed. I wrote Mr. Bush offering more targeted ways to reach our goals, and policies that I suggested worked. On trade, our Section 301 case is making China cut tariffs. We are inspecting jails suspected of exporting prison labor goods. We use limited sanctions to stop missile sales. We do not need MFN conditions to get results on these issues, and the same is true on human rights. The question is not whether we want to improve human rights in China. That is not the question. Everybody wants to improve human rights in China. The question is how to most effectively do it. The abuses in China are real. I myself met a man who was tortured with needles in a Chinese prison. I have spoken with families of political prisoners. It makes me angry. It would make anybody angry. But frankly, it is not enough to be angry. We need to get results. Pressure on the Chinese government helps. I use it myself last year to help free a Tibetan political prisoner. This year to help a jailed leader of the Tiananmen Square protests get his first family visit in 6 months. But pressure also has its limits. Whatever our threat, the Chinese regime will make no concession it thinks will weaken its hold on power. Only when ordinary Chinese people can secure their own rights can fundamental change begin. And only by making them more prosperous and better informed, that is, by promoting trade, not by limiting it, can we help. I have here today a white paper that offers a new human rights policy. But first, let me review what it means to condition MFN. To begin with, MFN, or most favored nation, does not mean most favored or best country. MFN is really much closer to least than most favored nation. Today, over 120 countries have lower tariff rates than MFN. Mexico, Canada, Israel, the Caribbean-based initiative members, and every country in the generalized system of preferences. Only 8 countries do not have MFN. MFN is just a standard, basic denomination status of trade. And in practical terms, conditioning MFN is like putting a hair trigger on an economic nuclear bomb. When it goes off, it will vaporize not only commerce, but the leverage with China on security issues, the environment, and on human rights themselves. Last year, we exported $9 billion worth of goods to China. 200,000 American jobs depend on those exports, and more every day. If we revoke MFN, China retaliates immediately. Trade disappears, jobs vanish. So does our future in aircraft, telecommunications, and other critical industries. But we also harm the global environment. China is entering an environmental crisis. If we revoke MFN, we can only watch. We lose a chance to slow global warming, protect our fisheries, and help China prevent millions of birth defects and other tragedies. On peace and security, we lose China's cooperation with North Korea, probably the most dangerous problem in the world. Our problems on missile sales will get worse if we revoke MFN. China could oppose us on Iraq, the Middle East, and at the UN Security Council. Worst of all, we would turn ordinary Chinese and a new generation of Chinese leaders against us as China begins the political succession to Deng Xiaoping. Finally, revoking MFN devastates China's prospects for human rights and democracy. It would cost over 10 million Chinese their jobs, and the human suffering would be monumental. As plants close, the government, fearing riots along the coast, would clamp down even harder. And it would blame the dissidents for wrecking the lives of millions of workers and their families. A lot of angry people would listen, and it's no wonder that Wang Dan, the student leader most wanted after Tiananmen Square, has already called on us to renew MFN status. This year, it is up to China. The President's policy is clear. If China does not meet the conditions in his executive order, MFN is lost. There is no way to soften the blow. There is no halfway or selective measure which we could administer or which would not make the Chinese retaliate with everything it's got. MFN will be gone. But I think it will not come to that. China can satisfy the order. They are in good shape on 2 mandatory conditions and on many of the 5, quote, overall significant progress conditions. For example, talks with the Red Cross, accounting for political prisoners, ending radio jamming. More from China is important, but I'm optimistic that China will do what it must, and MFN will be renewed. And if we can renew MFN, we should renew it for good. If we continue a conditional year-by-year renewal policy, sooner or later the bomb will explode. It is inevitable. Instead, we should move to a sounder, long-term policy. And that is what I propose in my white paper today, focusing on 4 areas. First, diplomacy. If human rights is to be a top priority, we need to give it enough effort to get results. Today, for example, our Shanghai consulate has only 1 half-time human rights officer. The U.S. should meet more publicly and more often with dissidents from China and Tibet. And we should give human rights a permanent, top-level focus by creating new bilateral, regional human rights commission. Second, economic leverage, using both penalties and incentives. One area is prison labor. If China will not fulfill our prison labor agreement, we should impose serious trade sanctions on products we have good reason to believe come from jails. We should condition support for loans from the World Bank. We Americans are the bank's second largest contributor. China is its largest borrower. It is responsible use of taxpayer funds to make sure borrowers meet basic standards of human rights. Governments which do so are more stable, less corrupt, and more likely to pay the money back. Conditions are an incentive as well as a penalty. We can concentrate our efforts on restricting loans to the most abusive provinces and support loans to the better ones. Another area is tourism, a huge source of money for China. The travel advisories we give American tourists in China should tell them which provinces have the worst human rights records and which the best. Third, non-confrontational ways to promote human rights. Angry speeches and stormy meetings get headlines, but they are not all that gets results. Working at local levels, teaching individual Chinese about law, communications, foreign languages, helping them understand the world better does much more. For example, the Chinese justice minister told me just last summer that he wanted more Americans to come to China on legal exchanges that promote the rule of law. We should give him as much as he wants. We should expand the Peace Corps, which opened its first program in Sichuan province last year. We should lose no opportunity to be engaged. And fourth, voluntary action for American business. This can be human rights advocacy. It can be codes of conduct or formal statements of policy like the Sullivan Principles to make sure our firms meet basic labor standards like the minimum wage and do not use child labor, slave labor, or allow political surveillance. It can be promoting safe workplaces. A lot goes on now. Northern Telecom works with Chinese suppliers to eliminate CFCs in electronics manufacturing. Dow has a policy of doing no business with enterprises that use forced labor or source products from prisons. IBM and Aetna give scholarships. These are real contributions to the life of ordinary people in China. We will stop it all if we revoke MFN. Altogether, what I propose is constant, broad engagement. If we use diplomacy, citizen exchange, economic levers including sanctions, and all the other tools in the foreign policy and economic toolbox, we will reach our goal. But cutting off contact by revoking MFN is the last thing we should consider. Frederick Douglass once wrote that, quote, "To make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless slave," end quote. He meant that to control people, you must stop them from thinking. You must keep them illiterate, isolated, ignorant. That is what Mao Zedong did. He shut China away from the world. He closed the borders, burned the books, shut down trade. That let him control the people. But today, because of trade and economic reform, in part because we give China MFN, his system is beginning to crack. Every day, more Chinese leave government work units to find their own jobs and decide their own futures. Every day, more buy satellite dishes, tune in CNN and find out what's happening in America, in Taiwan, and China itself. With MFN in place, the cracks will widen. With MFN in place, China will become the great, respected, democratic nation we all hope to see. Thank you very much.
And now we have Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Gil. I'd like to thank the National Press Club and you and the members of the Speakers Committee for the invitation to be here today. The last time I was here for National Press Club Luncheon, I had the honor of being the guest of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Today I have another honor, and that is to have as my very special guest Mr. Liu Binyan, As was mentioned, he's a leader in the Chinese international dissident community. He is a full-blooded, bona fide member of the press, a former writer for People's Daily. After the turmoil in Tiananmen Square and the events following, he had to flee China. He now is in Princeton, New Jersey, where he publishes something called China Focuses, and I say works with the international Chinese dissident community. It's an honor for me, for all of us, to have you be with us today, Mr. Liu Binyan. Thank you. I'm also pleased to see so many of those who advocates for human rights in China and Tibet, and indeed advocates for human rights throughout the world with us today. I welcome the opportunity to discuss China MFN with the distinguished senator, Senator Baucus, and I hope that we can stipulate, as I think Senator's remarks inferred, that we can stipulate that promoting democratic principles is an important American value and indeed a responsibility. In a few short weeks, we will be observing the 5th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And almost on that exact day, by the exact day, the President will have to announce whether China has met the conditions for his MFN executive order. As many of you know, and as the Senator indicated also, several times since the Tiananmen Square massacre, Congress overwhelmingly passed legislation to condition MFN for China, only to be vetoed by President Bush. President Clinton's executive order was an important step away from the annual confrontation between Congress and the administration on China policy. The executive order represented change and an important opportunity for the administration and a majority in Congress to deliver a unified message about human rights to the Chinese government. Before then, large congressional majorities voted time and time again to condition our trade relationship with China because of violations on human rights, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and violations of our trade law. The broad base of support for using MFN to address these concerns has been demonstrated repeatedly. Had President Clinton not initiated his executive order, Congress would have passed legislation conditioning MFN for China, and the legislation would have had stronger and many more conditions than the executive order. The executive order contains reasonable and achievable conditions for MFN renewal based on human rights and directs the administration's representatives to enforce laws governing proliferation and trade under those laws already on the books, but conditions MFN strictly on human rights consideration. I believe the administration has earned high marks for the implementation of its policy. In the 11 months since the executive order was signed, the administration has issued sanctions against China for the transfer of missile technology to Pakistan. On trade, the administration has successfully pursued an agreement to stop violations of our textile import quotas, known as transshipments, where they after they have exhausted their own quotas for our country, sew in labels from other countries and send them either through another port or directly from China. Much more needs to be done on trade, but the administration has that in the works. In terms of human rights, the President delivered his message directly to the President of China in Seattle. The Secretary of State, as you know, and the Assistant Secretaries have delivered the message to others in the Chinese government in Beijing. These actions were well received by our coalition in Congress, concerned about Tiananmen Square and the arrest and murders of those who have demonstrated peacefully for democratic reform, the continuing violation of religious, political, and workers' rights, freedom of the press, and the occupation of and gross repression of human rights in Tibet. One of the reasons I'm particularly pleased that Mr. Liu Binyan is here with me today is because of the important role that writers and members of the press play in the struggle for democratic reform in China. I, of course, refer to the courageous actions of Wei Jingcheng, the editor of an unauthorized magazine in China, and Wang Jingtao and Chen Ziming, editors of the magazine Beijing Spring. All three are currently imprisoned or detained by the Chinese government. In the words of Liu Binyan, these courageous men risked their lives for a better future for China and the world. How can we forget them now? I'd also like to call to your attention the case of Qi Yang, a reporter for the Hong Kong mainstream daily Ming Pao, who was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Qi was charged with espionage for obtaining information about interest rates from the People's Bank of China. Even the chairman of Hong Kong's pro-Beijing party had questioned the Beijing government about this arrest. This is very significant because the pro-Beijing party in Hong Kong never questions the Beijing authorities. And as you should also be aware that Wu Xishen, an editor of the New China News Agency, was sentenced to life imprisonment for releasing an advance copy of the President of China, Jiang Zemin. Life imprisonment for releasing an advanced copy of the President's speech. Mr. Wu's wife, also a reporter, was sentenced to 6 years in prison on related charges. Mao Zedong has said that power comes from the barrel of a gun. Even though the authoritarian rulers in Beijing control the guns, they clearly fear the power of the pen and use force and detention to silence those who use it. In addition to fearing a free press, the Chinese regime also fears free association for Chinese workers. That is why they would not allow Han Dongfang, a Chinese citizens and workers' rights advocate, back into China. They feared his organizing of workers as they are reacting to the corruption in China and the inequities in the system. President Clinton joined Congress in his concern over workers' rights, not only because it is right, but also for practical reasons, when he said, if we're going to open our borders and trade more and invest more with developing countries, we want to know that their working people will receive some of the benefits. Otherwise, they wouldn't have increasing incomes and they wouldn't be able to buy our products and services. Time prevents me from going into detail about many other violations of internationally recognized human rights, but I'd like to call to your attention the recently released Directory of Political and Religious Prisoners on Human Rights Watch Asia. Excuse me, it was right there, if you could just pass that to me. This book documents a continuing pattern of systemic suppression of dissent, political and religious, from virtually every province of China and throughout the Tibetan plateau. It is clear that repression continues in China and Tibet. It is also clear that the repression cannot be ignored. That is why Congress has voted repeatedly to condition MFN on improvements in human rights in China and Tibet. Conditioning MFN provides the U.S. with the best leverage to improve human rights because preferential access to U.S. market is critical to the Chinese authoritarian regime. It is critical because Beijing's rulers depend on the hard currency provided by their burgeoning trade surplus with the United States to fuel China's economic growth and keep their chokehold on power. Nearly 40% of China's exports will come into the U.S. in 1994. Many of those products will be produced by companies owned by the People's Liberation Army, which makes, among other things, the semi-automatic assault rifles flooding our markets. Many who oppose conditioning MFN for China characterize this debate of one of values versus jobs. They are wrong. It is better characterized as a debate about ideals versus deals. Let's look at the jobs argument. First, just how many exports go to China? In 1993, the U.S. exported a total of $460 billion worth of goods worldwide. $460 billion of exports worldwide. Our exports for China for that period totaled $8.8 billion, only 1.9% of our total exports. Less than 2% of our exports go to China. Although the 8.8 billion is a significant number, it is only 1.9% of our total exports. Secondly, our trade with China is not balanced. It is distinctly lopsided in China's favor. Since the Tiananmen Square massacre, our trade deficit with China has climbed consistently and at an alarming rate. It has gone from $6 billion in 1989 to a projected $30 billion in 1994. In addition to transshipments, as I mentioned earlier, the exporting of products made by forced labor, violations of intellectual property and copyright laws, and barriers to market access for U.S. products, trade practices have cost American jobs. China imports from the United States only a limited number of products in specific categories, and there are barriers to other products going into China from America. The administration is working diligently to open up Chinese markets to U.S. products, products made in America which actually produce jobs in America. American business interest in China is not being driven by concern about American jobs, but largely by interest in investment possibilities and the returns on those investments without regard to the environment and human rights. Some who argue against conditioning MFN for China on human rights argue that economic reform drives political reform. That is by no means inevitable. Leading Chinese dissident Fang Lejie has said, and I quote, "It goes too far to say that economic development alone will inevitably lead to democracy. The communist authorities clearly like this theory because they can use it to cover up their record of human rights violations. It would be wonderful if democracy did indeed grow automatically out of economic development, but history gives us, unfortunately, no such guarantees. The Chinese government has made its intentions clear. Deng Xiaoping has said that it will take dozens of generations for economic reform to lead to political reform, and that China will crush, and it has crushed, any attempt to hasten the process. Our country has seen the price of failed experiment in trickle-down economics. There is no reason to believe that trickle-down liberty will be any more successful. Like trickle-down economics, it serves to benefit only those at the top. Promoting human rights in China and Tibet today is a critical part of establishing a sound U.S.-China policy. Wei Jingsheng, Fang Lejie, Liu Binyan, and legions of Chinese dissidents with whom they work understand the nature of the fight in which they are engaged. They recognize the role that the United States can play, and in fact, they support our efforts to use our MFN leverage. In the newspapers of the free press, they have argued eloquently about the importance of the United States holding firm in its resolve to pressure China on human rights. Last May, when President Clinton signed the MFN executive order, he sent a signal around the world that support for human rights and democratic principles is an important pillar of a successful policy in this rapidly changing world. The American public supports his position. Last month, the Wall Street Journal NBC News poll showed that by a 2-to-1 margin, Americans agreed that, and I quote, "We should demand that China improve its human rights policies if China wants to continue to enjoy its current trade status with the U.S." And another poll last month funded by the Henry Luce Foundation found also that 60% of those polled agreed with conditioning MFN. The American public understands that our future lies with the Chinese people in their struggle for freedom, not with the Chinese dictators. The American public recognizes that societies based on democratic principles respect basic freedoms and the rule of law are the best neighbors and the best trading partners. In fact, in this time when we're very concerned about asylum seekers and people seeking political freedom, trying to come to this, the freest country in the world with the strongest constitution, it is in our interest for us to export that ideal to other countries so that people can exercise their individual rights in their own countries. The United States can have a brilliant future with China, politically, economically, culturally, diplomatically. It is time for that future to begin with the United States siding with the Chinese people. Thank you very much.
Now, before we get to your many excellent questions, we give a 5-minute rebuttal time to each speaker. Senator Baucus.
Thank you, Gil, and thank you, Nancy. I don't think there are very many people who disagree with what Nancy said. I think we all agree. We agree that there are abuses in China. Repression. It's outrageous. Nobody disagrees. I agree. Everyone in this room agrees. It's outrageous what's happening in China. Nancy said so with a long, very good, complete list of repression and documentation of abuses in China. We all agree. But that's not the question. The question is not whether there are abuses in China, whether there's suppression in China of human rights. That's not the question at all. In fact, Nancy also said that it's really a question of deals versus ideals. I submit that is not the issue either. That sets up a false either-or. Usually in life, we all know that things are not black and white. That if we're creative and if we're imaginative, we find a non-black-white solution that accomplishes our objectives, that gets the job done. And so I think very precisely the question is, Again, not whether they're abuses. We know that. Of course there are. We're outraged with them. I've spent a lot of time myself trying to address them. I organized a letter signed by 54 senators and sent to the president, sent to China, hand-delivered to President Jiang Zemin when I met with him not too long ago, urging China to release prisoners that have medical problems. And as a fact of the matter, one of the prisoners was visited after 6 months confinement by his family. In addition, I personally intervened in Tibet to inquire about and ask for the release of a Tibetan tour guide when I was in Lhasa just last August. And fortunately, I think mostly is because of my efforts, that Tibetan tour guide has been released. And there are countless number of examples where I and others are working to ensure to advance human rights in China. So the question is, how do we best accomplish our goals? What's the best way to accomplish our objectives? That's the question. And I do believe that we Americans now are paralyzed. We're paralyzed because we put all of our eggs in one basket with respect to human rights, particularly, and that's the MFN basket. We're paralyzed because it is the equivalent of an economic nuclear bomb. It's like the standoff between the former Soviet Union and the United States. We both had large nuclear arsenals. Neither side dared to use it. It paralyzed us both in a certain sense, and that is what's happening here with respect to MFN. It paralyzes us. Rather, we should have lots of eggs in our basket, lots of different tools, lots of different ways to accomplish our objective. They can be trade sanctions. Nancy herself, I think a bit inadvertently, is making my point when she says, look, we use trade sanctions against Chinese missile technology sales. We did, and well, we should. We threatened trade sanctions with respect to textiles, and we got results. We have threatened China under Special 301 to pursue our intellectual property case, and it's worked. We've said to China under regular Section 301, our regular trade laws, if you don't open up your markets, we're going to pursue remedies under Section 301. It's working, not totally, but in large degree. That's the point. She is right. You use individually tailored and well-sculpted remedies to address specific problems, not the blunderbuss, overall economic nuclear bomb of revoking MFN. And as Nancy said, there is a big trade deficit with Japan. Excuse me, with Japan too. Big trade deficit with China. She's right. A massive trade deficit with China. Do we revoke MFN just because we have a trade deficit with China? Of course not. It's absurd on its face. First of all, let's look at the composition of trade with China. Toys, that is products China sells in the United States. Textiles, wearing apparel, high labor-intensive products, which are made in China because of low wages, not made in the United States because our wages are too high. Also, all the investment now going into China from Taiwan, from Japan, from Germany, and other countries of setting up plants in the United States, too, to some degree, in China, which expands the deficit. But the main point is this. Let's address the improper trade barriers with China with trade remedies. Regular Section 301, Super 301, you know, all the panoply of tools that are available to us targeted to the problem, not by revoking MFN. It's pure and simple, not whether there are human rights abuses, we all know there are, and we're outraged with them, but rather how best to address them. And I think we're far more creative. We can address them much more efficiently by utilizing the panoply of various tools that are available to us, targeted to the problem, including human rights, including sanctions with respect to human rights, but sanctions other than condition MFN, which is tantamount to revocation of MFN. Thank you.
And now Congresswoman Pelosi will finish this up here before we get to our very many questions.
Thank you, Gil. I, like you, am very eager to get on with the questions, but I will use my 5 minutes. There's no question about that. As you heard from Senator Baucus, we do have, we can stipulate to certain things that there are abuses and that we have to pursue some avenues to redress them. That's, I think, the wisdom of President Clinton's executive order. Because as I said in my comments, if Congress had passed legislation last year, the conditions would have been much more strict and more difficult to achieve. So the President wisely, I believe, said instead of passing legislation which would be subjected to even more conditions with more amendments, we'll proceed with a lean, streamlined MFN executive order which addresses human rights and says we will use our other laws on the books for proliferation and trade. That's why this is a good policy, because it is targeted and it is focused and the conditions are reasonable and achievable. Senator Baucus made a comment in his speech. He said, MFN should be the last thing we use. And Senator, that's why we're using it, because it is the last thing we are proposing, or the latest. This is after trying many of the things that you suggest, which I think are all excellent ideas in your white paper. The fact is that we do have some sanctions as far as World Bank loans to China on the books. I was on the International Banking Subcommittee of the Banking Committee and now on International Operations where the international financial institutions are funded. And we have a law that says that the U.S. cannot, we don't fund loans other than basic human needs loans from the World Bank to China. The result is that China is the biggest recipient of World Bank loans because none of the other countries go along with it. And why should we be different? We should be different because we are different. We are the United States of America. And if we say we care about human rights, as the President has said, that it is part of a pillar of his foreign policy in which the American people support, then in fact we have to provide leadership on human rights and promoting democratic principles for the reasons that I think we all agree upon. As far as a bilateral commission is concerned, I don't think until China meets even some basic improvements in human rights that we should be engaged in a bilateral commission with the butchers of Beijing any more than we should be with Saddam Hussein. A regional human rights, similar to what we have in Europe and Eastern Europe, former countries formerly under the Warsaw Pact, is a suggestion that I think would have some currency among some members. But a bilateral commission with China, absent some very important movement on their part on human rights, I think is cosmetic, and I think it's just a subterfuge. Let's do that so we don't have to do MFN, but I don't think it would produce any results. As far as companies saying they won't use products used from prison labor and that we should not receive them in our country, that is the law now. The law now says no products made by prison labor may be exported and imported into our country, from any country, including China. The Senator takes credit for that. I think we all deserve some credit because, frankly, the message that we got back from Beijing on the prison labor negotiations memorandum as well as the intellectual property memorandum was compromise, compromise, compromise. That was the message Beijing sent to its negotiators at the table, because if we don't come up with an agreement, we will lose MFN. So we believe that much of the success on some of these other overtures is because the threat of loss of MFN was out there. So when you say it's the last thing we should use, we wouldn't be here today. I mentioned to Gil earlier. The names that I talked to you about, the book I held up and the rest, about focusing on the violations in human rights, we wouldn't be here today unless we were striking at a place where lots of people had a concern. We believe that the President's reasonable and achievable conditions can be met by the Chinese government. We believe that we have to stand firm. If we say this is what our policy is, we have to stand firm until the Chinese make overall significant progress on the conditions contained in the executive order. We believe then that maybe they will meet the conditions. They're reasonable and achievable. And then when they do, we can talk next about some of the other suggestions that you have in the white paper. The idea about tourism and all the rest, expanded relationship is great. I mean, we all encourage people to people, Peace Corps and the rest of that. They're all excellent ideas. I wouldn't fault any of them except for the bilateral commission. But that is not where the real leverage is. The Chinese may not like democracy, and they may not even like capitalism, but they do like money, and they need hard currency, and it consolidates their strength and their chokehold on power in Beijing, and they will look carefully at any risk that may be taken to remove the very, very lucrative market that they have in the United States for Chinese products, while at the same time putting up barriers to American products going into China. My time is up. Thank you.
Okay, let's get right to the questions because we got a pile of them and we only got about 10 minutes. So first for Senator Baucus. Chinese leaders have repeatedly stated that the West cares more about money than human rights. If the United States unconditionally renews China's MFN status after such a high-profile debate, isn't the message a sign of weakness on the part of the President and a signal that the U.S. will not support the cause of human rights in China?
I'd first like to address a point that Nancy made. Is she thought that conditions can be met prior to June 3rd. I agree with her. China does not have to do very much to meet the conditions in the President's executive order. I very much hope China goes a little bit farther, because if it does, then the President can easily find that the conditions have been met. The real question is, what's next? Let's hope and pray the conditions are met so we can then focus on what's next. That is after June 3rd. And that's the question. And I do believe that we Americans should indefinitely and unconditionally extend MFN, because it's what every other country in the world does. No country in the world is in this debate at all. Now, why are we in this debate? It's an historical accident in part, but also because we Americans properly support human rights around the world, much more than any other country in the world. And we can continue to do so with an indefinite, unconditional extension. How? With all the various tools we have available to us. Now, Nancy says, well, the tools haven't worked very well. That's true, because I frankly submit that under the Bush administration, that he did not try, and the State Department and the Treasury did not try very hard to work through the World Bank, for example. Did not high-profile human rights abuses in China. There's a whole infinite list of actions we can take to address human rights in China. Take the World Bank, for example. With a little bit of imagination, we can go to the bank and say, hey, other countries, you know, we want you to come along and start conditioning some loans. They may balk a little bit at first, they probably will, but if we're resistant about it, using other diplomatic tools, we can probably get some action, or at the very least, we can threaten to withdraw our contribution to the bank. Again, it really comes down to how serious is our country in addressing human rights using the various ways available, other than condition MFN, because it is such an overkill. It is a remedy which is so disproportionate to all of the problems that we have that it's not credible anywhere in the world. If it's not credible, let's find something that is credible. And I listed lots of ideas that I think can enable us to more effectively address human rights. What we really want here is to, as effectively as possible, address fundamental change in China. And fundamental change includes all the things I've listed and many others that I have not listed and that you can think of. It is not going to happen with such high-profile, high-stakes, hair-trigger economic nuclear bomb of withdrawing MFN if China government does not address human rights. It's just that simple. And I think we all know that, frankly. So the next question is, which tailored remedies will work the best? And we can then, that's the second debate. That is, once we get off MFN, then the debate is which other of the remaining remedies are really the most effective and work. That is the real question. Thank you.
Congresswoman Pelosi, total trade embargoes have failed to do anything to change outrageous government abuses in countries as close to the United States and as dependent on the United States as Haiti and Cuba. Why would the Chinese leaders risk having their country fall apart like the Soviet Union did just for American trade?
First of all, I'd like to make a very strong distinction between use of MFN as a lever and a total trade embargo. I don't think anyone is talking about any total trade embargo. What we're talking about is the fact that although the Senator says most countries, and he is correct, have MFN as a normal trade relationship with us, China does not. And every year the President must request a special waiver to grant China most favored nation status because China is not a free market economy. Hopefully it is an economy in transition, but the fact is it is a communist system and a centralized economy, and for that reason the President must each year request a special waiver. So the use of MFN as a tool, and the reason the debate has been coming around year in and year out, is because every year the President must request it. And when he does, we are saying, some in Congress will say absolutely no. We are saying condition it on improvement in human rights. And some of us have suggested that we target the revocation to just the state-run industries. That was, in fact, what was in the Mitchell-Pelosi legislation that we have passed through the Congress a couple of times, targeted revocation on products made by state-run industries. So we're by no means talking about a trade embargo. We're talking about using leverage on MFN, same as we did with the Soviet Union when it was the Soviet Union, and then we insisted on certain codification of laws guaranteeing rights in Russia and the republics of the former Soviet Union before MFN could be extended to those countries once they were not centralized economies. So when you ask about why would the Chinese risk for trade, well, I do think one of the reasons they are resisting it is because they know the more openness that there is, the more rights they give people, the more their days are numbered. I have said to the leaders in Beijing myself that what my children say to me, you are yesterday, we are tomorrow. You are yesterday, those young people who speak out peacefully for freedom are tomorrow. Now, it may be inconceivable to you, but it is inevitable to them. And we should help play a role to make the inconceivable to the butchers of Beijing and the inevitable of the young people, the time frame that the inevitable becomes the status quo, the shortest distance of time.
This question for Senator Baucus. In view of China's defiance before and during Secretary of State Warren Christopher's visit, what makes you think human rights conditions will improve?
First, I think it's important to recognize that the United States automatically gives MFN to Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya. We're not even questioning whether to condition MFN to those countries or any other country. It's automatic. The question is, why treat different countries differently? And once we start going down the road of treating MFN, condition MFN to one country but not to other, it essentially violates the basic premise of the GATT, which is extending the same trading privileges. And again, MFN is really least favored nation trading status. It's really, I gotta say, if there's ever a title that would get the reward for the greatest misrepresentation or mislabeling law, it's MFN, because it's not really most favored nation trading status at all. And as Nancy, and even though withdrawal of MFN may or may not be a trade embargo, in fact it really is, because if MFN is revoked, automatically, under the law, it's self-executing, we revert to Smoot-Hawley tariff levels. 5-fold increase from an average of 8% to 40%, automatic. And if goods coming from China automatically get a 40% tariff on them, that is tantamount to a trade embargo. It's just going to happen. Now, some say we'll have selective tariff increases. First of all, that takes legislation in Congress to pass. I can't see Congress doing that. Worse than that, it means that we're starting to be selective in different countries we have tariff levels on. This country, not that country. That's a violation of the basic premise of the GATT. We're just going backwards. Why pursue policies that just are non-starters, don't work? Rather, let's find remedies that do work. It is true that there are human rights abuses still in China. The real question is, how can we be sure that China will address them in another way? Well, I say the present way isn't working very well. Here we are, we're conditioning MFN. It's not working very well. I think China could possibly, probably will, just do enough to jump the high bar. Just enough. And then, is that fundamental change in China? Of course not. So how do we address fundamental change? Instead of putting all our eggs in this one basket, it's a frontal, total, comprehensive, assault on the problem in the various ways available to us. If we do that, we're better assured that China is going to address our human rights concerns than we are under a present failed policy that just isn't working very well.
Unfortunately, we're about out of time, and Nancy Pelosi just fighting it. She's ready. She's got something here. Maybe finally we got this thing going. No, well, no, we're not done yet. You got one more shot at it. But before asking the last question, I'd like to present you both with National Press Club mugs, which you can either throw at each other or toast each other with.
Thank you.
And certificates of appreciation for appearing here.
Thank you very much.
And a reminder that audio-video transcripts can also be obtained by calling 1-800-500-9911. Now, the last question, there were so many good ones, so I'll give Representative Pelosi, because I know she has a couple things you wanted to say about that last thing. But also, 2 years ago, Representative, you introduced a bill denying MFN to Chinese state-owned companies only. Do you think support for this proposal is gaining strength in the Clinton administration and Congress? And then to Senator Baucus, do you think such a proposal of a two-tier MFN status can be viably administered? Now.
Well, first of all, that legislation has passed the Congress a number of times. Senator Baucus may not be familiar with it because he voted against it each time. So I understand why you didn't have to be responsible for a vote, because it was what was contained in Senator Mitchell's bill, which was proposed to the Senate. It was placed on President Bush's desk, and it was vetoed. It was also a bill that we were proposing to President Clinton last year, but the President stepped in with a much gentler executive order, a much leaner executive order. Before I answer the question directly, though, I want to say one thing, once and for all. Iran, Iraq, and Libya have a trade embargo. They do not have most favored nation status, nor should they. But that issue that people bring up, that they have MFN, well, they would if we traded with them, but we don't. So, let's square with what the reality is. Okay. And as I said, the senator said these are non-starters to target certain industries because they wouldn't pass. They have passed the Congress a couple of times. Now, what was your question here?
I think I put it over
what
here.
Was it about?
The two-tiered state.
Oh, yeah. I believe that in the Congress, I'll try to be brief, in the Congress we have this range. We have a very few in the House of Representatives, a handful of people who want unconditional renewal of MFN. We have a large number who want total revocation and just grow impatient with our conditionality year in and year out, because they think the evidence is clear, revoke it, they'll get the message, and then we'll get some improvement. Instead, some of us have chosen a middle path, which is a more moderate path, which says it's only fair, if you're talking about conditioning renewal, and I think you'll agree with this, Senator, that you have conditions that are achievable. Otherwise, you are talking about revocation if you heap so many conditions on that couldn't possibly be met. So we had as our standard reasonable and achievable conditions which can be met in a 12-month period, and that are the only conditions that we would put on a bill. We also put in the legislation targeted to state-run industries in order to encourage the private and entrepreneurial sector in China. We believe it is possible to enforce such a law when sanctions on against intellectual property violations with China were being planned. One of the approaches that was looked at was to revoke only on state-run industries. If you can do it for violations of intellectual property, I think you can do it for violations of intellectuals' rights. If you can target sanctions on textiles, then I think you can target sanctions for human rights as well. So this is, I believe, we have to find, and I think many of us have been working on it, a way in order to target the state-run industries. If it's complicated on some products, then let them in. Come down on the side of a more liberal policy, but nonetheless make sure that the impact is felt on the state-run industries. I say that still with the hope that China will meet the conditions and MFN will be granted, because as I said before, our legislation was predicated on renewal, not on revocation. If we wanted to revoke, that's an easy vote. And there will be that vote, because there are those in the Congress who will always deny the President his waiver. In any event, I want to just say that as far as the American worker is concerned, this is not about protectionism, it's about fairness. And some have said in the Congress, Ronald Reagan was the best American president Japan ever had. And George Bush was the best U.S. president China ever had. Now Bill Clinton will be the best international president the United States has had, with his balanced view toward producing exports, which also produce jobs in the United States. Thank you very much for your hospitality today. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Senator Baucus, you get a chance here to answer the question, do you think such a proposal of a two-tier MFN status can be viably administered, or do you...
Well, first I want to note that, thank you for the coffee cup, but it's, look on the bottom, it's made in China.
I should have looked.
I would hope in the future we don't add to our trade deficit with China, but rather by American products. Second, Nancy a couple of times has said all this legislation has passed the Congress. Well, it's never enacted into law because President Bush vetoed it, and second, it's not going to pass. I mean, the Congress today will not pass conditional legislation. The House might, but the Senate will not, because it takes 60 votes in the Senate to withstand a filibuster, and I know that there are more than enough votes to prevent passage in the Senate, so that's just not going to happen. I think the Congress is really becoming, if I can be a bit presumptuous about this, more realistic about our relationship with China, so I think that just because last year and year before conditional legislation passed, that does not mean it's going to pass this year. And I think, frankly, that that will not pass this year either, because again, the Congress is beginning to focus more closely on what's really going on here, looking not at the rhetoric, but rather at the facts and the circumstances to try to find something that works. Now, two tiers got problems. Look at China. It's such a composite, such a mix of private and public owned. It's virtually impossible in many instances to distinguish between what's private and what's public. For example, I met with an insurance executive in Guangzhou. He was very proud. It's the first private, I think they're selling life insurance in southern China. I asked how they're capitalized. Well, the government's capitalized them. So is that public or is it private? I mean, there are countless examples like that. It's virtually impossible to distinguish, what's a public company in China versus what's a private. In fact, the United States Customs Service has said it can't be done. It can't be done. It can't distinguish. You can't administer it unless China is very cooperative and basically allows all our customs inspectors to say, okay, this is public, this is private, and so forth. Now, if we target state-owned enterprises in China, do you think they'll be cooperative? Do you think they'll come and lead us what's state, what's private? Of course not. It won't work. It sounds good on the surface, but it just won't work when you look at it. Now, Nancy met textiles with respect to the proposed textile problem we have, the textile problems we have in China. Sure, we can identify textiles, but the point there is not private textiles versus public textiles. It was textiles. That's not too hard to determine. It is virtually impossible to have a meaningful, realistic policy targeted only at state-owned companies versus private in China. Ministers do deals. They got investments in private companies, and it's a slosh. I mean, we've all been in China, most of us. I mean, if they're an entrepreneurial society, people are doing deals with the government, around the government, on their own. They're virtually, it is not at all like America, where there's a fairly separate distinction between what's public and what's private. Not in China. And I just think that it's a policy that just may sound good on the surface, but won't work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope on your way out you all will make reservations now for Aung San Chan, the Chief Secretary from Hong Kong, who will give us an entirely different perspective on this. That concludes our program for today, and I'll just hide. And political consequences if the United States actually followed through with its threat to end most favored nation status. The President is expected to announce his decision on June 4th. As one State Department official said this week, it's human rights on the one side and business on the other. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Our guests today are Senator Max Baucus of Montana and Representative Nancy Pelosi of California, represent two different schools of thought within the Democratic Party. Congresswoman Pelosi of San Francisco sits on the Foreign Operations Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee. She chairs the Congressional Working Group on China and serves on the House Intelligence Committee. After Tiananmen Square, Representative Pelosi wrote and helped push through Congress a bill protecting Chinese students in the United States and another bill requiring China to improve its human rights record in order to continue to receive most favored nation status. Congress passed both acts, but President Bush vetoed them. The Congresswoman has argued that the United States should use its considerable economic clout with China to press Beijing harder on human rights. Senator Max Baucus has served 2 terms in the House before his election to the Senate in 1978. He is chairman of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee and a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, where he chairs the Subcommittee on International Trade. He also serves on the Intelligence and Agricultural Committees. While Senator Baucus has criticized China's human rights policy, he has said that tying that policy to most favored nation status is ineffective and harmful to China's reform process. Senator Baucus has said that revoking MFN is the trade equivalent of dropping a nuclear bomb, and it would launch a nasty counterproductive trade war. Now on to the debate. Both of our guests will have a 12-minute statement and a 5-minute rebuttal. Then we will take your written questions. The order of appearance was done previously by a flip of the coin, and Senator Baucus chose to receive. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Max Baucus.
Thank you very much, Gil, and members of the National Press Club, members of the Fourth Estate, curious onlookers, and friends. Before I begin, I'd like to recognize 2 good friends and associates of mine in my life as a public servant, and that's Owen and Virginia Garrett. Why do I recognize them? When I first ran for public office 20 years ago, seeking the Western congressional seat, I can remember sitting in Owen's office. He's the owner, he and Virginia, publisher of the Silver State Post. And I did not know they're in Washington. I had not seen them in many years, 10, 15 years, I think. They walked up to me, and I just wanted to recognize Virginia and Owen, and I don't know the answer to that question yet, is why in the world I want to run for public office. Anyway, Owen, it's very good to see you here. The argument over MFN status for China is not new. It's about 4 years old. Most of us think it began with the massacre of Tiananmen. But in fact, it really began later. It really opened when...
Yes. Richard Salmon of Congressional Quarterly and a member of the Board of Governors of the National Press Club. Ed Gresser, legislative aide to Senator Baucus. David Ahern, Washington Bureau Chief for the Bloomberg Business News. Skipping over one speaker for the moment, we have Christy Wise, freelance journalist and the chairwoman of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Skipping over our second speaker, we have Jack Reynolds of Jack Reynolds Communications and the member of the Speakers Committee who arranged today's luncheon. Next to him, we're honored to have Liu Binyan, editor of China Focus and a leader in the international Chinese dissident community. Next to him, we have William Eaton of the Los Angeles Times. Next to him, we have Junji Miura of the Kyoto News Service. And finally, Douglas Harbreck of Business Week. We are altering our usual press club luncheon format today for a special event, a debate on whether the Clinton administration should continue to extend most favored nation status to the People's Republic of China. This issue has been hotly debated since the Tiananmen Square massacre in June of 1989, when Chinese troops forcefully put down a demonstration that was trying to open up the nation to democracy. As a candidate, Bill Clinton had criticized President Bush and the Republicans for saying that the best hope for opening the Chinese society was maintaining trade relations. Now, as president, Mr. Clinton must face the economic Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Gil Klein. I am the club's president and a national correspondent with Media General Newspapers. I'd like to welcome the club members in the audience today, as well as those of you who are watching us on C-SPAN or listening to us on National Public Radio or the Internet Global Computer Network. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind you of some upcoming speakers. On Monday, April 25th, Aung San Chan, Chief Secretary of Hong Kong, will present a speech entitled Hong Kong, Little Dragon, Big Future. On Tuesday, April 26th, Bill Malden, a cartoonist, the famous cartoonist, World War II cartoonist, will speak in conjunction with the National Portrait Gallery exhibit, Reporting the War, the Journalistic Coverage of World War II, which salutes war correspondents who covered the Second World War. And on Wednesday, April 27th, Senator Bill Bradley, Democrat of New Jersey, will talk about violence in America. Transcripts and audio and videotapes of this luncheon are available by calling 1-800-500-9911. If you have any questions for our speakers, and I trust that you will, please write them on the cards provided for you at the tables and pass them up to me, and I will ask as many as time allows. I'd like now to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. Please withhold your applause until all the names are read. From your right, Henry Hartzenbusch of the Universal Press Syndicate. Carl Hartman of the Associated Press.
Congress became convinced that the Bush administration would do nothing, not only on China's human rights abuses, but on trade barriers and sales of dangerous weapons. Many people felt MFN conditions were the only alternative to the Bush policy. I then disagreed. I wrote Mr. Bush offering more targeted ways to reach our goals, and policies that I suggested worked. On trade, our Section 301 case is making China cut tariffs. We are inspecting jails suspected of exporting prison labor goods. We use limited sanctions to stop missile sales. We do not need MFN conditions to get results on these issues, and the same is true on human rights. The question is not whether we want to improve human rights in China. That is not the question. Everybody wants to improve human rights in China. The question is how to most effectively do it. The abuses in China are real. I myself met a man who was tortured with needles in a Chinese prison. I have spoken with families of political prisoners. It makes me angry. It would make anybody angry. But frankly, it is not enough to be angry. We need to get results. Pressure on the Chinese government helps. I use it myself last year to help free a Tibetan political prisoner. This year to help a jailed leader of the Tiananmen Square protests get his first family visit in 6 months. But pressure also has its limits. Whatever our threat, the Chinese regime will make no concession it thinks will